So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our November Inside Track webinar. It's good to have you again, and happy holidays for those of you who celebrated Thanksgiving. Hope you had a great one. We have a lot of data to cover here today, and this really sort of our kickoff for the election season. We're just under 1 year out from the 2024 election, so we really are starting to see in earnest how that's going to develop. But we have a lot of other data, non-election horse race data that we want to get through today. So we're just going to sort of jump right into it. I'm Chris Jackson, as Ellen said. I'm joined by our senior data journalist, Sarah Feldman, who will actually take us through several of the issue sections that we have in the survey. And as Ellen said, please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to use the Q&A field of the meeting application at any time to register those, and Sarah and I will answer as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So let's just dive right in. First off, what's the agenda? What are we talking about today? So we're going to do, as we usually do, talk about the issue landscape, what the main issues facing the American public are at the moment. We think that's always a very important way to start the issue, the conversation off, because it really grounds what it is that people care about and allows us to put a little context around some of the more news-driven topics that may dominate the discussion at any one given point in time, but may not necessarily be as close to what America writ large cares about. Then Sarah is going to talk us through a little bit of a deeper dive in our latest economic data. We have a lot of interesting items we've asked in the last month or so about how Americans are viewing the economy, a lot of really contradictory signals we're seeing from that she's going to describe. Then she's going to go from that to talk about some of the other recent issue polling that we've done, touching across a range of issues from abortion to guns, lots of hot button issues facing America right now. And then finally, I'll close the webinar off talking about some of our most recent data and as it affects the election next year. And then, like I said, leave a space for questions. So let's go into the main issues. What are the main issues right now? Well, the economy continues to be the dominant issue in the United States, but not truly dominant, right? It is only about 1 in 5 Americans saying it's the most important problem facing the United States. That leaves essentially 4 in 5 Americans, 80% of Americans, saying something not the economy is the #1 issue facing the country. But that population is very divided across a wide range of topics. And what this is telling me is that we are facing a very diffuse and potentially very noisy issue landscape where there isn't really a single dominant topic that is going to drive how the election unfolds next year. The economy will certainly be one of the leading aspects, one of the leading issue areas, particularly inflation and cost of living, which is the piece of the economy that Americans are sort of most concerned about at the moment, and Sarah will have some data about that in a moment. But then other issues, immigration, crime, conflict, healthcare, etc. These are all things that are going to matter. And I think it's important to note that even some issues that may be well down the list, like abortion at 3%, can actually have a major impact in deciding the outcome of the election. Indeed, we've seen in several off-cycle elections in the last 2 years, really ever since the Dobbs decision, abortion has been a deciding factor in Democratic sort of overperformance in elections and driving turnout, even though only 3% of Americans are saying it's their #1 issue. So, I think it's very important. This is an indicator of what Americans are worried about, but it's not necessarily definitive. It's not sort of a be-all, end-all of like, what's the main thing? But the real takeaway is that there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of concerns Americans have at the particular moment. There's not any one thing that's really dominant. Next. And then looking at sort of what Americans are attuned to, this is from the Ipsos Carometer. This is a regular survey where we ask Americans, have they heard about a particular event and how much do they care, how relevant is that event to them. In the last couple of weeks, of course, the conflict in Israel between Israel and Hamas is sort of the dominant issue that Americans are both hearing a lot about, but they also care strongly about. They think it's an important issue. Just behind that, we see the global rise in anti-Semitism as a consequence of that conflict. And then there's a lot of other things that sort of fall off. So that, for instance, there's several pop culture or entertainment related items that sort of fall into the care less area. So the Rangers winning the World Series, the new Beatles song being released, Britney Spears memoir, all of these things sort of falling down into the care less thing. But I think again, it's important to note that just because we're not seeing large majorities who care about these topics doesn't mean that there isn't a committed population who does so. Texas Rangers fans, of course, probably very elated that they won. Britney Spears' book was a bestseller, so there's a lot of people who care about it, even if they don't necessarily form a large majority of the public. And at the same time, we're seeing a continued pattern with economic news where people aren't necessarily hearing a lot about what's happening with the economy, even as it continues to be something very important to them. So we see home sales falling, the new home sales falling to the lowest point in over a decade, not something people are aware of, but that they care a lot about. And this lawsuit against the Realtor Association about commissions, again, something Americans didn't know about, but were very interested to find out. So there is this interesting, there's political events, people tend to know what's happening there, economic news, other things like that, where they don't know but care about, and then sort of pop culture, which sort of runs a bit of the gamut in terms of how people are responding. So again, very interesting sort of landscape. I think indicative of this sort of diffuse period where there's a lot of different things going on, a lot of different events competing for our attention, and likely to be a characteristic of the next year as we move towards the election. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about some of our latest economic data. Like I said, there's a lot of interesting things happening, a lot of sort of contradictory trends that we're seeing, and Sarah's going to provide a little light onto what's really happening there. Sarah, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Yeah, a lot of interesting things to talk about today, given the economy is the main issue for most Americans. And we're going to start off talking with about consumer confidence. So here we're looking at our consumer confidence tracker going back to 2002, and we can see that consumer confidence remains in this really stubborn, middling position where it's not, people aren't really feeling great, they're not feeling really awful either. And I think, looking at some of these macroeconomic trends and how people are perceiving them goes a long way in explaining perhaps why we're kind of caught in this middle place. So we can see that, inflation has been falling in fits and starts. That's generally a positive thing, but still higher prices are hurting Americans, and it's not coming down quite as quickly or as smoothly as many would like. Unemployment, though, remains historically low. Very few Americans report knowing someone or that they themselves being unemployed. So a positive piece of economic news. And again, I think this tension puts us in a very middling place when it comes to consumer confidence. So to kind of get into some of those misconceptions or kind of mismatches in perception that Chris mentioned at the top, we're going to first start off by looking at some Yahoo Finance polling we did earlier this month, where we asked registered voters where they're seeing the biggest impact in rising prices. And most registered voters, by and large, said food prices, followed far behind by gasoline and housing. And that's really actually quite in line with what we're seeing in some of the macroeconomic data. What is driving inflation right now is food prices, is gas, is housing. So when it comes to kind of the bad side of the economy, inflation being a continued issue, inflation continuing to hurt Americans in their pocketbooks, Americans are pretty attuned to what's going on there. But when it comes to unemployment, so kind of the rosier side of the macroeconomic spectrum, we see consumers kind of fall out of step with some of the macroeconomic data. So here again in this Yahoo Finance poll, we asked Americans whether they view or whether they perceive unemployment to be unusually low, about average, or unusually high. And 1 in 5 registered voters report that they see unemployment as unusually low, and that minorities, regardless of partisanship, agree with that. So, if we actually look at the macroeconomic data, we can see that that's pretty out of step with what we're seeing. So if we compare unemployment to the 50-year trend, 10 since the beginning of COVID, since Biden took office, unemployment is well below all of those different points in time. So this is one area where there's some positive economic news, but consumers and voters aren't really noticing that. We're not really experiencing that in quite the same way. And I think that leaves a big question for, how does Biden get remembered for this? How are voters and Americans overall understanding Biden's position in the economy? And I think, the short answer is it's not leaving him in a great spot. Over the past 2 years, most registered voters say that they've been barely keeping up or falling behind, and very few say that Biden and his administration have helped them financially. And I think that's all to say that, voters and consumers are noticing the negative sides of the economy and not so much the positive pieces. And that question of blame then gets meted out onto Biden and his administration. And just to linger on that question of blame for a little bit longer, because it, again, goes so far in understanding how the economy gets played out as a main issue in an election cycle. Here again, we're looking at our Yahoo Finance polling, and partisanship goes a long way in directing where people are putting their blame. So Republican registered voters are much more likely to blame the current government policies. We can read that as Biden and his administration, while Democrats are more likely to attribute blame for inflation to corporations or COVID era disruptions. And independents are kind of a scattershot across all these different items in terms of where they're placing blame. So, I think what's really important to remember to the presidential election going into 2024 is we cannot just look at macroeconomic numbers or macroeconomic trends, because what really matters is people's perceptions of these numbers. How are they experiencing it? What does this feel like for them? Because that's really what's going to drive voter behavior when it comes to the economy, the main issue, and ultimately who wins. So all important things to keep in mind as we move into next year. So here we are going to move into the rest of the issue landscape, and we're going to start first with some foreign affairs. So here we're looking at how opinion splits on this question of US isolationism, whether the problems of Ukraine and Israel are the US's business and whether or not we should interfere. And we can see that Americans overall at the top line level are pretty mixed. Younger Americans are more likely to say the problems of Ukraine and Israel are none of our business and we should not interfere. There's some differences by partisanship, particularly on the question of Ukraine, but age is a bigger dividing factor on the question of Israel than partisanship, which is pretty notable. We spend a lot of time in these presentations talking about how important partisanship is. So to have another demographic kind of trump that difference, I think is really notable to underscore. And I think important context also to build around this slide and this data point is that a lot of younger Americans, they're, if not all, most lived through the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. That was going on when they were growing up, and I think that's really framing a lot of opinion right now and a lot of the differences we see by age here. So that holds important implications for policymakers going ahead, looking to the future, and how they go on to frame US policy. Now, international affairs, of course, is not just something that happens over there. It is also a domestic issue, and we saw that play out quite a bit these past few months. The government almost shut down a number of times over the question of funding, sending aid to Ukraine and Israel. And when we ask Americans in this Reuters Ipsos poll what they think about that, we find that Americans are pretty mixed on sending aid and weapons to Ukraine and Israel. And there's no real difference by age here, actually. And that again holds really important implications when we look ahead, not that far into 2024. Speaker Johnson has kind of kicked this fight into the new year. So the question of aid and sending weapons to both Ukraine and Israel will certainly be top of mind. And I think where the public stands on that will be important to keep tabs on as government funding hangs in the balance yet again. Moving on, here we're looking at how Americans view AI policy. Now, the Biden administration released an executive order, signed an executive order on regulating AI. And what we find when we ask Americans how they feel about many of these different measures is that most Americans, regardless of partisanship, are kind of on board with several policies to regulate AI. Where we see party ID and opinion split is really when AI interacts with partisan issues like the criminal justice system, like immigration, like federal funding. On these items lower down on the chart, we can see, Republicans kind of diverge from Democrats in their support for these different policies. And what that really tells me is that AI right now is not really a partisan issue. It's not something that divides many Americans along that kind of fault line. But when it gets sucked into our partisan dynamics and the partisan time we're living in, those kind of predictable patterns of partisanship start to emerge. And that is, again, an important space to watch as AI continues its ascension. So, partisanship, again, we talk about that a lot here. And the question of guns, gun violence, and school shootings is one in which partisanship plays a huge role in framing opinion. Here we are looking at polling we did with NPR earlier this fall, and we asked Americans who should be most responsible for keeping kids safe in K-12 schools from gun violence. And we can see that Democrats are much more likely to say that the government should be the primary entity responsible for keeping kids safe, while Republicans are much more likely to say school security in some form or another should be responsible for keeping kids safe. And I think what's important to note here is a lot of the adults that make up this survey, a lot of the legislators right now, actually aren't people that have experienced a lot of active shooter drills or school shootings themselves. If we look at the experiential data we have, if we ask current K-12 students whether they've experienced an active shooter drill, majority say that they have, while very slim minority, so 1 in 10 of their parents say the same. So I think there's a real, experience gap here when it comes to this issue, and it will be an interesting space to watch as some of those kids grow up and become voters and also survey respondents. So we'll see how that stuff changes in the future. Now, another big issue that's gotten a lot of press recently is abortion and the electoral success Democrats had on the backs of a lot of abortion referendums and candidates in this off-year election earlier this month. And I think a lot of the data that we have from earlier this year in June, I think paints a really compelling picture for why abortion has been such a mobilizing issue for Democrats, both in the midterm last year and also in this past off-year election. So here we did some polling around the anniversary of the Dobbs decision, where we found that a majority in states where abortion is illegal or not protected report that it's become harder to get an abortion compared to 6 months ago, so early in 2023. And at the same time, we're also seeing that wide majorities of Democrats and independents oppose allowing states to significantly restrict access to abortion. And so what that tells me, kind of taken together, what that shows is that there is a significant chunk of Americans who are noticing something being taken away from them, and another significant chunk of Americans who oppose a lot of these restrictions. So I think that creates kind of this perfect firestorm for mobilization around this issue, and the big question remains whether that carries forward into 2024, and if Biden's able to kind of buoy some support around that, and we'll just have to keep watching to find out. Before I kick it over to Chris, I do want to plug a great white paper we just put out with our Chief Research Officer in Public Affairs. We run through a lot of important work the Knowledge Panel is doing to bring DEI concepts into practice every single day. It's DEI essential to doing good survey research, and we kind of walk through all of the important work the Knowledge Panel is doing there. The Knowledge Panel undergirds, it's the backbone a lot of the great research we present here. So I definitely encourage everyone to check it out if you haven't already. And with that, I'll kick it over to Chris, who will run through our election update.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so again, lots and lots of good research. It's all available on the Ipsos website, ipsos.com. All of this is public data, public information, so we certainly encourage you to peruse any of it yourself. You're welcome to use or cite it as well, because again, it's all public data. All right, next slide or 2 slides. Yeah, here we go. So first off, as we get into the election, it's always important to reflect back on how the public is looking at the current government. And right now that's Joe Biden, because with an election like this, a re-election, which is what's most likely to be the case, it's really first and foremost a referendum on the incumbent, how people feel about the incumbent. Is the incumbent doing a good job or not? Is sort of the first indicator to really look at to make sense. And what we're seeing is that Biden is really not seen as doing a great job by a majority of Americans. Indeed, only 39% in our most recent core political tracking say that they approve of the job he's doing. 56% saying that they disapprove. And these numbers have been pretty static since last year. Really about a year and a half, we've been pretty much at this place with Biden's approval rating stuck somewhere around 40% overall. And that's really sort of where he's been bouncing around for, again, the last year and a half. And this is important because a president with this kind of approval rating, with 2 in 5 Americans approving of his job performance, is not a lock to win re-election. Indeed, if we look at elections around the world and compare this to other election circumstances, what we see is a president with approval rating at about this level is only about a coin flip, about a 50-50 chance of winning re-election. Half the time they win, half the time they don't win. So indeed, a lot of other factors can come into play. And that's in contrast to a more popular incumbent. So if the president's approval rating were, say, 50%, they'd be more like a 90-10 chance to win re-election. They'd be almost a lock to win re-election. Or the other direction, if a president's approval rating was like 30%, their odds would be pretty bad. It'd be more like a 1 in 5, 1 in 6 odds of winning re-election at those low odds. The other thing, though, I just want to point out in this, because sometimes I do hear from folks, they see these numbers and they're like, Biden's at 39%. How could he ever win if he needs 50% or 51% of the vote to win re-election? And it's important to remember that this is a survey of all Americans, not a survey of registered voters or likely voters, which is a smaller pool of the population. Remember, in presidential elections, only about 2/3 or so of Americans actually vote. And this 39%, if you extrapolate it out to all American adults, that actually still equals 100 million or so Americans, which is vastly more than the 81 million Americans who voted for Biden in 2020. So you can see there's still actually a pool of Americans larger than the pool that voted for him that approve of his job performance, even at this sort of low level. Now, of course, those 100 million are not all going to be voters. A certain chunk of those are not going to show up, not going to be voters. Like of all the 56% who disapprove are not all voters as well. But it does, again, sort of reconcile how Biden can have this low approval number and yet still have a path to winning an election. Next slide. So switching gears slightly from considering the general election to the Republican primary, which kicks off in earnest really in January, a little over a month from now. And what we're seeing is that picture has been relatively static. It has not changed significantly over the last couple of months. Donald Trump continues to be in a very dominant position with the Republican primary in most head-to-head polls, national polls, winning more than 50% of the likely Republican primary vote. And indeed, even when we asked the question slightly different, like we did here from a recent survey we did with 538 in the Washington Post before the last Republican debate, and just asked who people are considering, Republican primary voters are considering voting for, we can still see that Trump controls a much larger set of the consideration space than anyone else. DeSantis, who's the next runner-up at 48, or Nikki Haley behind DeSantis at 38%, aren't even necessarily even considered by half or less than that of the Republican electorate versus Trump, who has almost 2/3 of it. We'll be doing another one of these polls actually next week with the next Republican debate, so we'll be able to get a little bit of an update. And the one thing that has happened is we've seen DeSantis's position, which was relatively strong at the beginning of this year, has sort of slid throughout the course of the year. And in the last month and a half, we've actually seen Nikki Haley in a little bit of an upsurge, gaining a little bit of ground where she's basically tied with DeSantis in national polling right now, and even ahead of him slightly in some of the early states. Now, again, both of them well behind Donald Trump. So it's, Donald Trump and then DeSantis and Haley behind. But that has been the one sort of bit of movement in the last couple of months, as we have seen this little bit of a Nikki Haley boom, in support. But again, nothing really denting Trump's dominant position. And part of why Trump's position is so dominant might be that the Republican electorate just doesn't seem to be tuning into the contest too strongly yet. We asked this question about what people did when the last Republican debate happened, and we found that essentially 3/4 of likely Republican voters, remember, this isn't just these are people who are going to vote in the Republican primary. They're kind of the most engaged Republicans. 3/4 of them said that they didn't watch the debate. They didn't pay attention to it. Only 1/4 did, which I think reflects just how people may not find the stakes high enough. They may not think it matters. They may just, who cares about the debate if you're already behind Trump? Lots of reasons for it potentially, but all of it sort of taken together is that people aren't really following what's going on in the Republican race in a close fashion, even the people who care most strongly about it. Next, and then sort of taking another stepping back to the general election, after looking at Biden's approval rating, the other thing that we think is always important to keep in mind is thinking about what the issue landscape is and who the public sees as stronger on a particular issue or set of issues. And because we have this very sort of mixed issue landscape, it's a less than perfectly easy to explain or perfectly easy to forecast picture right now. I think it's always important to note how many people are in that both or neither category. The plurality of Americans are oftentimes not in favor of either side, Democrats or Republicans. That's a characteristic of American politics we've seen for a decade and a half now. But when we do look at sort of how people are viewing Republicans and Democrats who have the opinion, we see this interesting picture where Republicans are stronger on a handful of issues, particularly some of the biggest issues like the economy, like inflation, like immigration. Republicans are seen as better on those issues. When we turn to culture war issues, on the other hand, Democrats tend to do better, and in some cases, like on abortion, like on healthcare, have very dominant positions versus Republicans on those issues. So it's essentially, and this is why we think it's important to pay attention to what the dominant issues are facing America, because whatever people are focused on at any given point in time is going to give relative strength to either side. And we are seeing this sort of interesting phenomenon where Republicans are stronger on issues like the economy, and yet Republican media, conservative media, tends to like to talk about the culture war issues more, which isn't necessarily the ground that is more favorable to Republicans. So there's a sort of interesting negative feedback loop where they draw focus of Republicans and of Republican elites to these culture war issues, which actually helps them potentially lose to Democrats, rather than just focusing on very bread and butter issues like the economy, like inflation. So we'll have to sort of watch that moving forward, and if that continues. But that's part of what explains how Democrats have been able to win some of these off-cycle elections in the last year, is the focus became very much on things like abortion access, or democracy, where they had sort of a stronger position, and not necessarily on sort of the bigger economic picture in the context of that race. And it put the race in a place where they are just in a much safer or stronger rather position overall. Next slide. Yeah. So and then just getting to the horse race, which we've left to the last here. This early on, horse race polling is not terribly reliable. I think all of the horse race polling that you may have seen out in the public domain, you should take with a grain of salt. Sarah's actually been working on an op-ed with Cliff Young, who's the leader of our public affairs practice, where one of the findings is that a year out, polls are about 9 percentage points off of the ultimate numbers for elections. So, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty this far out. There's a lot of things that can change. Early polls take with a grain of salt. But what we're seeing right now in these early polls, after I say all that about taking with a grain of salt, is that it seems like it's going to be a very close election. Indeed, in our polling, it's basically a tie within the margin of error. Currently, we have Donald Trump up 2 percentage points, but that, again, that is within the margin of error. And that's the case with or without Kennedy included as a third-party candidate. I think it is worth noting, though, that there isn't actually much difference between people just saying someone else and saying Kennedy, which is, I think, a characteristic of the large level of disenchantment or disenfranchisement that a lot of Americans feel, that Americans are not super positive about the candidates that are being offered in this election cycle. Indeed, this is probably the second most unpopular set of general election candidates that we've seen after 2016. And maybe by the time this rolls around next year, it might be the most unpopular set of general election candidates that we'll have ever seen. So Americans certainly are discontent. And I think that discontent does provide a bit of a wild card because, you know, we do see in the next slide that there is a large chunk of Americans who aren't necessarily voting for their candidate. Instead, they're voting against the other side. That's more dominant with the Democratic Party and Joe Biden voters, 50% of whom say they're voting against Trump. You can see that in Democratic messaging, which is very consistently sort of talking about how scary Trump is. But even among Republicans, and Trump, you know, does have a very devoted base of support, we do see 40% saying that their primary factor is voting against Biden and his policies. So we have these people that are really mostly voting against the other side rather than voting for their side. And I think that presents a bit of uncertainty, right? Because those people are not necessarily mobilized by love, they're mobilized by fear, and that fear ebbs and flows, right? It isn't necessarily a steady state. Maybe they aren't scared come election day and they stay home, maybe they are. So I do think that the election, the next 12 months as we head towards the 2024 election, are likely going to be a wild ride, and I think it is likely to remain a close election given where things stand at this moment in time. Now, of course, there are the potential for a lot of events to change the shape of the election. If Trump is found guilty in any of these trials against him, that might have an impact. Some polling has suggested it could. If the economy turns negative in a significant way, that definitely is problematic for Joe Biden because he's already weak on the economy, and that might be a death knell. And any number of other factors may tilt the election because right now, again, it does look pretty close to a coin flip. All right, I think, yeah, so that's it. Next, we're up for questions. Let's see what we got. In our August 2020 briefing, we showed a slide about the news cycle churn on a daily basis. Have we updated that into 2024? Is it the same, worse, or better? We've not updated it, but thank you for reminding us about that because we will definitely dig that up and refresh that for the next webinar because I remember the piece you're talking about, and I did love that one too. So thank you for the reminder. We'll definitely include that in the next go around. It is a lot of churn. There's a lot of churn out there. There's a lot of stuff going on. Let's see, other questions. So there's been a lot of focus on younger voters lately. Is there anything to be noted or worried about with that group? Sarah, do you want to take the younger voter question?
Sure, yeah, there's been a lot of headlines and a lot of worries about younger voters. Right now, I think it's a little too early to get in a tizzy about that right now. The full polls, like we mentioned earlier, are not very accurate a year out. There's still a lot that can happen. You know, a 9-point polling error at the top line level looks even wider for that subgroup for younger voters. It's certainly a concern. It's polling is showing us a snapshot in time, and it's showing an apathy and a lack of enthusiasm from from young voters, particularly for Biden. So it's a worry, but I think we've got a long ways to go before it's a giant concern for everyone.
Next question. Late breaking news has been Trump wants to overturn the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. Do we have any new thoughts on this? We haven't polled on it. I've seen those headlines too. It is probably something we're going to stick into one of our next polls, so we will be able to speak to that. We actually have a Reuters poll that we'll be fielding in the next week, so we might have something on this by this time next week. What I can say though is that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, has definitely gotten more popular the longer it's been in existence. So it's gone from something that was a bit of a 50-50 issue to something that's maybe a little bit more of a 60-40 issue with 60 in favor. And it's not necessarily something that is a big winner among Republicans the way it used to be. Indeed, a lot of people have always liked a lot of the individual provisions of Obamacare. For instance, the expansion of coverage for young people up to age 26, always very popular. The limits on pre-existing conditions or the abolishment of pre-existing condition limits, very popular. Limits on sort of lifetime expenses, or all these sort of different components of Obamacare have always been very popular. It's just the overall bill itself was not as popular. So it isn't necessarily something that I think is a political winner for Trump, but it is probably something that helps him with the Republican base, because it is something that's still a little bit of catnip with sort of the core Republican electorate, but honestly not something I would expect them to really try to enact if Trump and Republicans were to win control of government in 24. Next question. Does your polling provide any indication of whether Israel-Hamas will remain a live issue into mid-2024? Sarah, you want to tackle that one?
Sure, yeah. It is certainly a really big issue right now. It's something, as Chris showed during our main issue section, that Americans know about and care a lot about. Whether or not this issue is top of mind for Americans in the middle of 2024, I think really remains to be seen. I think it's going to depend on what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening on the ground there. And I don't think anyone can say with any sort of tea what exactly that will be and what that will look like. But it is certainly a big issue that Americans care about right now. And so definitely for the short-term future, I expect it to continue. Whether that carries into mid-2024, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. What are our thoughts on the value and impact of the Koch network recent decision to back and support Nikki Haley for the Republican nomination? I think it doesn't matter much in terms of actual votes, and it's kind of late in the game for the money to make a big impact. That being said, TV ads are effective in a short-term context. Like, they have a very short half-life. They don't really change people's minds for a long time, but they do change people's minds a little bit. So to the extent to which they're able to blanket some of the early primary states with ads, it may help her standing, may help her solidify sort of a second place position. But it's hard to see how it really changes the fundamental dynamic, which is Trump dominating the race. Because again, even in head-to-head polls where we've seen just Trump versus Haley or Trump versus DeSantis, Trump is getting 70% of the vote in those sort of, or the Republican vote in those sort of head-to-head scenarios. So it's not like, Trump's got 50% and the other 50% are just waiting to coalesce around somebody else. No, Trump has 50% and then he can have more if some of these other people are dropping out. So I think it probably takes something bigger than just TV ads or GOTV spending to really fundamentally change the nature of the election on the Republican side. And, it's not surprising, because what we see is that most of the Republican candidates aren't really running against Donald Trump. They're running against each other. And, maybe they're sort of obliquely making an argument that maybe they'll have a better chance against Biden than Trump would. But that's sort of a hard thing to do when you're unwilling to criticize Trump directly. So, why would we think that they would be able to really sort of unseat Trump's loyalty with the Republican electorate's loyalty to Trump? Any predictions on the Newsom-DeSantis debate tonight? Will it help DeSantis at all? Sarah, you want to take that one?
We got a question about this in the internal webinar we did too. It's a hot topic people are curious about. I think it's fun. I think it's going to have some fun headlines that come out of it. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference when it comes to the scope of both the Republican race and also, Biden in the general election either. But it'll certainly, I'm excited to see the headlines that come out of it and see what happens with that later tonight.
Yeah, I do think that might be a more entertaining debate than we've seen in the Republican primaries so far, and quite likely a more entertaining debate than we'd see if even one happens between Biden and Trump next year. Because, we really have two culture warriors who are ready to go at it with Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis. So entertaining, perhaps, or maybe not. We'll see. Let's see. Next question. If inflation continues to moderate, will that have a positive impact for Joe Biden? Sarah, you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. That is a really good question as we look ahead to 2024. I think we can, Cliff and I have taken a look at inflation and its impact historically on presidential approval, and we found that a moderation of inflation does in fact help presidential approval, and that, as Chris mentioned in our election update, goes on to put Biden and the president or the incumbent in question in a better position when it comes to the election. So, presidential approval is really important for determining who ends up winning. It's an important predictor when it comes to that. And inflation does hurt presidential approval. So if we see an improvement in that, I think we can expect to see Biden's numbers improve and then, go on to improve his position overall.
Yeah,
but we're not talking crazy, amazing approval numbers. We're talking a couple percentage points, which again makes a big difference when these elections are decided by a few thousand people.
Yeah, indeed. We were actually talking about this in the office this morning, that, Biden currently 39-40%. And just given the division of the country and sort of the way that news ecosystem sort of works, it's hard to see Biden getting above 45%. Even best case scenario by the time the election rolls around next year. Approval rating, and honestly, if he could get up to 43%, that would be kind of miraculous for him. We do typically see incumbent presidents, when they start running for re-election in earnest, do see about 3 percentage point improvement in their approval ratings over the course of sort of the campaign period. So basically sort of summer into November. So, that would put Biden up to 42% maybe from where he is now. And that, again, a better shape than the 39 he's at currently. But just, it's hard to see him getting back up to sort of those popular levels we've seen presidents at, 2-3 decades ago, where you'd routinely see presidents at 50-60% approval ratings. It's just unlikely to happen in sort of our current polarized day and age. Even if inflation does continue to improve or Biden is able to mount a vigorous campaign. Those are all the questions we have. Give folks a moment if anyone does want to submit another item. While we give people that moment, just again, this is all based on public data. It's available on the Ipsos website. This presentation will also be posted on the Ipsos website in the next day or so. You're welcome to use it to excerpt anything from it if you'd like. We'll have a recording of this webinar up there as well that you're welcome to share if you'd like with any colleagues or contacts that you may have. Sarah and I also are certainly always available if you have questions or are interested in particular pieces of the data. This is really a subset of a much larger set of information that we've produced over the last month, 2 months. So, there's a lot of richness, a lot of interesting insight that we have into sort of the American public at this particular moment in time. We do have Our next webinar will not be until January. We're taking the rest of we're taking December off. It's not December yet for the holidays, but January 24th will be our next Inside Track. We'll be in the heart of the early election primary schedule, so we'll have lots of interesting data to share with you at that time. But otherwise, until then, have a great holiday. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Jackson, Sarah Feldman. Have a great day. Thank you.